Welcome to the Design Vault, a show about the past, present, and future of design. The Design Vault is a conversation hosted by Shum and Thamer Abanami, reflecting on iconic products and ideas from the past and rethinking them from new perspectives.
So what's on? What are we going to talk about today?
Today we're talking about the device that finally cracked the code on the elusive personal digital assistant back in the 90s.
PDA. It's not public display.
No. It is personal digital assistant. These things were a thing in the 80s and 90s. And today we're talking about the PalmPilot. After years of failed attempts by companies like Apple with the Newton and various Japanese electronic organizers, Palm created something that actually fit into people's lives and workflows.
Yeah, and when I was doing research for this episode, what really fascinated me was it's really a story about constraints. You know, the founder, Jeff Hawkins, and his team didn't try to do everything. And they focused on doing a few things really, really well and at the right size, the right price, and the right connection to your digital life. So I thought it was hitting that sweet spot. It's so key.
Absolutely. And unlike so many devices that came before it, the PalmPilot wasn't just like another gadget to carry around. It was really an attempt to be an extension of your digital self. The ability to sync your desktop information made it valuable in a way previous attempts just weren't, where you had to input everything yourself into a tiny little device.
And before we dive into the Palm story, I think we kind of have to set the stage. And you know, the 90s was this kind of crazy, I would say, cornucopia. Is that the right term? Of like digital devices. Like there was just so many gadgets. Let's just call it that. Like I remember using I think in the early 80s, 90s, like these Casio digital diary series.
Yeah,
I think it was, and there was a Sharp. I also had a Sharp Wizard, and it was basically it's like a amped up or super calculator. These souped up calculators that try to like have a calendar and you can organize like appointments, but they had really limited memory and it was so disconnected from your everything that you had, right? So you had to input things manually and keep track of things.
There was no desktop connectivity or any kind, really.
Yeah, I mean, it was just this kind of standalone gadget.
And in 1993, Apple comes out with the Newton, right? The Newton message pad, which launched around $700, which was a lot of money.
That was a lot of money, actually. That was $700.
Yeah, and it was a revolutionary concept, but I think the execution was a little flawed. The handwriting recognition became a target of jokes.
And I think it used a stylus, right? You had to...
Yeah, it had a stylus. And in many ways, it tried to solve too many hard problems simultaneously and was too ambitious for the available technology. And I had with regard to the Newton, I had this amazing opportunity to chat with Larry Tesler, who is no longer with us, but about the Newton. This is probably 20 years ago we had this chat. And he had mentioned that, there was some parts of this the story where the handwriting recognition was not ready. The marketing department was really excited to get this out the door, and they kind of said, "Don't worry about it. We don't have to emphasize the the handwriting recognition." But really, the marketing literature was all about the handwriting recognition.
Was Larry responsible for copy and paste? I think it was.
Larry's visionary.
A bunch of things.
Visionary, yes. Yeah. Goes back to Xerox PARC. And then the Lisa OS and the Mac, etc.
Yeah.
You know, then we move into we're now in the mid 90s and there are these market gaps and opportunities.
Yeah. And there wasn't really a mass market yet. I think this idea of like having a device you carry with you to keep track. It was some people use it like a journaling diary, or some people use it for like business, for keeping contacts. I remember like contacts was probably the most useful thing, like just finding phone numbers But the existing solution was just too expensive and too limited. You know, who wants to carry a thing that only does like random things that you might need once in a while?
Yeah, it's eventually what you call the junk drawer problem. It sounds interesting. You do a bunch of stuff. You realize there's too much friction. It doesn't really fulfill what you really hoped it would, and then it ends up in junk drawer.
Yeah, the gadget drawer.
Yes.
I think this is where I think Jeff Hawkins and team enters. You want to share more about that, Thamer?
Yeah, so in this landscape enters Jeff Hawkins, right? And he worked on handwriting recognition technology at Grid Systems before founding Palm Computing in 1992. His background was electrical engineering. He did neuroscience studies and was interested in how the brain works. His previous work at Grid Systems was on pen computing.
Mm.
And in 1992, with Donna Dubinsky and Ed Colligan, they found or create Palm computing. Some of their early projects was not actually to create the PalmPilot itself. It was to create software for other devices before the hardware. So their roots were right in the software side.
Yeah, I remember pen computing was really big back then because early on, I think people thought the mouse was very limited and keyboard, and a more natural user interface was handwriting, and be able to recognize your handwriting. And there was a lot of efforts, a lot of different companies I remember was trying to attempt to create a new way to interact with computers with pen.
Yeah, it was a holy grail at the time, and it continues to be that way in some parts. And the kind of devices they were trying software for was something called the Zoomer PDA, which was a partnership with Casio and Tandy in 1993, which ended up being a commercial failure, but it was a valuable learning experience, and it taught them what not to do. Some of the lessons were too complex and expensive. Users didn't want a desktop computer in their pocket, and they needed really focused functionality rather than feature overload.
Right. Like having a PC in your pocket.
Yeah.
Even though a lot of people tried to do that.
Yeah, but my favorite part of the story and from the lore at the time, which stays with us, is this idea of the wooden prototype story, Albert. Maybe you can tell us about this.
The wooden prototype. It was made of wood. So I think what Jeff focused on the user journey, like, hey, don't just focus on the device and what the device looks like or what the shape of it. How do you actually carry the device every day while you're on the go? He recognized early on that you need a device that actually fits in your pocket. So we thought the entire approach of what a PDA should be and prioritize on creating a form factor out of a block of wood, which was a size, I think, equivalent to a deck of cards. And he was able to put that in his shirt pocket. You know, this is when people had shirt pockets that you put your stuff in.
Right.
And he mocked up a paper interface with drawn buttons and screen and just glue it on. And that was his mock-up, a prototype.
Right.
And as a very user-centered design approach, I would say.
And so he would carry this thing around and pretend to be using it. And if somebody was trying to schedule a meeting with him, he'd say, hey, hold on, let me check my calendar. And he would was fully into it, right?
Right. He would pretend
he would take
this was a working device.
Yeah, and then he would tap it and then do 4 taps and then say, okay, yeah, sure. He was really trying to do something that I think we call prototyping. Some people call it prototyping. You've heard of this, where it's a little bit of a step simpler than prototyping, where you're really just trying to test the basic concept before you go into the full prototype.
The design philosophy, this user-centered approach, kind of allows you, through the power of observation, understand the human behaviors and potential needs. So I would say it's almost like, in some ways, also precursor to design thinking, that empathy of what end users have to struggle with. So you're walking in their shoes. So the form factor really drove all the other decisions and created the constraints, but also created the context on how the device would be used.
Yeah, it really is a device driven by constraints, right? And that's what made it special. The physical design decisions, right? You end up with a size that was smaller than most of the other devices. So the final size was what? Something like almost size of footprint of an index card, almost 4.7 by 3.2.
Yeah, it's pretty thin. I remember for that class of device.
Thickness of almost 0.7. Yeah. We're talking in inches. Less than 6 ounces with batteries, slim enough for a shirt pocket, and curved back for ergonomics. And, hardware specifications, we don't want to get too much into it. It's a 68,000 series Motorola processor. RAM is minuscule. We don't even get into it. Actually, I will. 128K of RAM in the Palm 1000, and then they expanded that to 512 by the time they got to the 5000. But my favorite part, and the reason I'm going through this list of features, is the display. It was a monochrome display, and it was 160 by 160, which is a very constraining thing.
It's,
right?
it's pretty low res.
Right.
But also, I think the size of the display drives a form factor, right? And it's literally, most devices even today is driven by the display size.
Yes, it's the canvas for the interactive experience that goes screen to screen, and I think it really helped them limit choices, right?
Well, and also the resolution and the size of the display is probably the main power draw.
Right.
That's also dictates your battery life. If you have a high power, it's like the backlighting and things like that can consume a lot of power.
And so by picking this bill of materials, this allowed them to get 3 to 4 months out of 2 AAA batteries. So that's also, you don't have to charge that every day. You don't have to charge it every week. You actually change the batteries every quarter, which is actually, better than having to charge something twice a day. And then we get into the physical interface, Albert.
Yeah. So the form factor, as we said, was fit in a shirt pocket. It was very compact. It also had dedicated hardware buttons, a power button, a dial you could adjust. I remember you could. It's a roller
contrast.
Just contrast.
Yeah,
which seems crazy like today, but it had 4 application buttons. It's almost like the home menu now.
Right.
I think that was one of the first ones to actually have a home menu, and it had a storage for the stylus, so you wouldn't lose it. I think that was the other observation. Like, what do you do with the stylus? Like, it's such a small detail, but it's so critical. And it had a dock. What was the hotsync connector port? I remember.
Yeah, it looked like a charging dock.
Yeah, like a charging dock.
Except you hook it up to your computer.
Right, and that's how you would get the information to synchronize. So I think all those things again really speaks to the power constraints and being very focused.
One of the most innovative aspects I thought was the Graffiti handwriting recognition system that they created.
Yeah.
Right. So instead of trying to recognize natural handwriting like the Newton, which was like a really tough task.
Yeah, which required a lot of processing power.
Yeah, and it's tough. It's just tough because of the variation and
everyone right, cursive versus
Yeah, I can't even read my own handwriting, let alone a Newton. But Palm created a simplified alphabet that was easy for the device to recognize.
Well, it's also the constraint.
Yeah, because so the human had to conform to the device in this case, which is not necessarily good, but it's better than promising the human something that was impossible, which was handwriting recognition on that form factor. And so the Graffiti was this, for example, an A would be like an upside down V. That's an example, right? And so, and they had this game called Giraffe, and you'd launch the game and it would basically have letters falling or something, and then you would have to write it with it before the next letter appeared.
Right, that's how you learn, right?
Yeah, and the learning curve was pretty... I'm usually skeptical of these kind of things where you have to learn a new thing, but for the context, for the time, it was pretty easy to pick up because it was just very simple.
Well, and also the payoff, it worked. It was accurate.
Yeah.
So it was responsive versus the laggy. I remember all the handwriting back then was this kind of like very laggy and also pretty inaccurate. Like, what was the accuracy rate?
97% recognition accuracy, because you have single stroke letters and separate areas for letters and numbers. There was a little section about below the screen where you could put letters, and then next to it was numbers. And so you just had to, they really thought through, how can we make this work with the least amount of friction? They minimized that friction as much as they could. And really beyond Graffiti, I think what makes the PalmPilot interesting is it almost felt telepathic. Do you want to maybe get into that, Albert?
Yeah. The founder, Jeff Hawkins, has a very, I would say, well, let's just say unique, but also philosophical approach where I think Jeff and his UI lead at the time, Rob Haitani, coined this term, the Zen of Palm, into every screen, which was a device that woke up instantly and allow you to do common tasks. And they really had this philosophy of 3 taps or fewer. So again, very, very clear constraints. And Haitani literally had a tap counter on the team to say, hey, every task I need to get to, it can only be 3 taps or fewer. So the result is an experience that felt instant, almost telepathic. There's a minimal hierarchy and no loading, and this real focus on doing a few things really well.
Yeah, and back then, things like instant on and no wait cursors and things like that.
Right, no boot up time, remember?
That's really, I mean, always cold boot, you have to deal with some of that, but they were able to hide a bunch of that stuff.
Or get into a sleep state.
Yeah. And so all that was exotic for the time. That was kind of bleeding edge, because I remember Even things that came afterward, like MP3 players, still had boot times and recovery. It wasn't something that was pervasive in the industry, and I think they were very cognizant of moving the needle there.
Yeah. The other key innovation, I think, in terms of UI design that Atani and team created was the launcher. I think, again, we take it for granted, like especially on iPhone and Android now, on all mobile smartphones, that there's this launcher of apps, right? But they had this home screen with 11 monochrome icons and a persistent title bar for time and battery. Like, just, again, these are standards now that we kind of like take for granted, but that was the real first time where you could immediately access these applications that you need and be able to reach it at one tap. And I do think having that immediacy was a key part of the success of Palm.
Yeah. And I think also the hardware taught the software. The 4 hard keys on the front were basically the 4 main experiences: date, address, to do, and memo. Then there was a scroll input mapped 1-to-1 for most of the common apps and list navigation, and that allows you to have this muscle memory where you could launch the calendar, flip down a long note, and not have to look at the screen. And that's really crucial for that anytime, anywhere capture. You're having conversation, pull out of your pocket, boom, boom.
Yeah, there's a very clear hierarchy of what you can do. Like, it always spoke to, like, back to this telepathic UI. Like, hey, it will do these things for you. And it's front and center. Like,
right.
I think for me, the other key, and probably the most important, actually, I think, is the hot sync UI, where, I mean, back then, when a lot of ways to get information out of your laptop was really cumbersome, or your computer. You had to create files and then save it to another device, and you had to like do these, I would say, these arcane transfer.
Right.
Palm had hot sync. At a touch of a button, it would just synchronize.
Right.
And you didn't have to think about it.
Yeah, the button was on the dock. You click a button, everything that you want to happen, the information that you captured on the device makes it back to your calendar on the computer. Anything that updated on the calendar and the computer makes it back to your device, and you have a fresh, up-to-date personal digital assistant back in your shirt pocket.
It had these subtle, I would say, delightful feedback loops, like auditory cues. Again, we kind of take for granted, like the little bloop blop. Like,
yeah, they did. Yeah, they had. I would say that was something that really I recall from my days with the PalmPilot.
Yeah, just a gentle pop for a dialogue confirmation. Progress bar meter visible on every screen, and even the I remember there was this IR beaming used to send information, and you could see it leaving your device.
The tiny animation, yeah. Yeah, this stuff matters, because if you look at how they set this up, they really attacked this idea of cognitive load with the devices that were there before. And they wanted to drop it as close to zero as they could. People who had never used a computer could schedule appointments in seconds, right? It was not just the cognitive load of things like the Zoom or other devices. It is really trying to figure out how we can make this equation work for people with the minimum amount of friction and having to think about it.
Yeah, and for me, now I'm going on a bit of a tangent on cognitive load. That seems like such a technical term, but oftentimes I think for design, for me, it's getting into the flow. Meaning cognitive load, I see it. It's like, it's the difference between kind of system 1 and system 2 thinking. Like, when you have to think about it versus it's almost like it just happens in the background. You don't even have to consciously think about it. That's when I would say computing actually has value.
100%. You see that in the symbiosis between the hardware and software. You see it in their design playbooks and of Palm. It was really compelling. It really tried to take limited hardware and turn it into an invisible assistant. It was always on. It was never in the way. And it was laser focused on the moments that you needed it the most.
Now, shifting gear a bit, we mentioned HotSync already, but I think there's a deeper story around HotSync. It seems like, oh yeah, you could get information off your computer, but HotSync, I would say, unlocked a whole ecosystem for Palm, and I think sometimes we call that the moat. I see it as a way to create additional value.
Right.
And HotSync was a game changer, and it was an extension of your digital world in some ways. It sounds ambitious, but I do think it was warranted.
Yeah, but I know we brought it up earlier, Albert. And like, well, this sounds easy.
Right.
It sounds. Why are you talking about it so much and repeating yourself? Because it's actually hard.
Yeah, it's hard when you change something on your Palm, and then it has to update. Take your Outlook calendar, right? Again, we take this for granted now today, but everything there's synchronizing all that information and making sure there's no redundancy. And like, remember, we had to, like, imagine you have to, like, redundant calendar appointments, and they're not.
Oh yeah,
those were the conflicts that Palm had to figure out with HotSync, with the ecosystem. So it had to work with all these other apps, not just Palm's app, right?
Yeah, and I had to figure out and develop algorithms for resolving the conflict. Let's say you updated something on a PC and you updated something on the Palm in the same hour while they were apart, or the same time even. How do you handle that? How do you handle a bunch of edge cases so you don't stop the user and force them to intervene too much? And a lot of companies came later with building on this thinking and creating modes of their own. But I think they were really the first to tackle this problem with depth.
Yeah, and eventually, in addition to to-do lists and calendar and even memos, they were able to do email, which was kind of, I would say, the killer app on the go for a lot of people. Like, wow, I could send email while I'm on the go and I don't need my computer.
And then there's the software ecosystem development. Palm, they created something that would become incredibly important in today's tech world, which is a thriving third-party software ecosystem.
Well, having additional apps,
they can't do it all themselves, right?
And we do that today with, obviously, on our phones. Like, well, I need an app for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they were the first one to actually do it at scale, I would say.
Yeah, they had to do a developer platform strategy. The Palm OS SDK was released to developers. It was a simple environment. It encouraged third-party applications. There was initially no approval process, and I have a story for you about this.
Did you create a Palm app?
Yeah, direct distribution to users. I remember scrolling through a bunch of app catalogs.
So they didn't have a store, right?
I don't think they had a store initially. I think, right. But I think they had a list on their somewhere on their website or something. But I remember browsing the list and finding Palm GPS app. And I knew that there was no wireless modem in this thing.
Yeah, is there GPS on Palm?
Yeah, no. Exactly. So I was thinking, okay, this has to be a joke. Download it, run it, install it, run it, click it to run, and then I see a giant X on the screen. And then 3 seconds later, a string of text materializes saying, "You are here." I don't think they would have let this through. Yeah, if there was a more,
and you pay 99 cents for that.
No, it was free. No. It was free. But this is happening fast, and this is before.
It's someone's version of Hello World.
Yes, it was funny. But they had eventually games, entertainment categories, medical and healthcare applications, business productivity tools, educational software. Yeah. Vertical market solutions were huge with like airlines and things use them.
So eventually, it sounds like they had thousands of apps, right?
Yeah,
and they did create the virtuous cycle, right, of apps, and creates more users, creates more developers, right? That's the flywheel you're trying to create in our ecosystem.
Yeah. They became a platform, not just a device, right?
Yeah. So how did Palm do? It sounds like it was a home run. It was a big hit, right?
Well, Albert, on this podcast, we don't like to have these simple.
What?
Step 1, cool idea. Step 2, home run.
That's it.
That's too boring for us. Okay, launch success. Right. The launch was in 1996. It was an extraordinary reception.
Huh.
What made it an immediate hit was 1 million units sold in the first 18 months. Right. It was the fastest growing computer product in history at the time.
Wow.
The price point for the Palm 1000 was under $300. So it was the magic $299. They had a peak 70% market share for the category around the year 2000.
Well, in some ways, they created a category, right?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, they weren't the first to category, but they created the first.
Mass adoption, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And it was praised for its reliability and simplicity. Synchronization and hot sync was highlighted as effective in reviews. Battery life exceeded expectations. The Graffiti system was generally well received. The adoption patterns were strong in healthcare, popular with field sales teams, and early adopters, of course, and business executives and professionals.
So it moved from gadget to being a real productivity tool.
A tool, yeah.
Yeah. So
now
that's it, right? That's it. They won.
That's it, right? Yeah. So that's kind of like where the other podcasts stop and everybody high fives. But our podcast is going to say, no, this is complicated.
What happened next?
Yeah. Well, whenever there's success, you attract competition. And Microsoft entered the market with Windows CE in late 1996, and later with their Pocket PC platform. And so they tried to replicate the desktop Windows experience on these devices. It was much more complex than what Palm had, and it had higher costs and higher, of course, hardware requirements. The other competitors outside of Microsoft and licensees of Windows CE, these other companies like HP, et cetera.
So Microsoft entered with a software solution.
They had a software solution, and they were working with licensees.
So basically taking the page out of the Windows playbook.
Yeah, they were like, okay, well, can we take Windows to this category and apply the Windows playbook to it?
Right, and literally call it Windows Compact.
Yeah, we're going to squeeze all this stuff that we call
Windows into.
Yes, into and then there's this thing called Windows Embedded, and then there's an offshoot of Windows Embedded, that Windows CE, which is CE is kind of for this stuff, for this category. Okay, and so now it gets more interesting. It's not just Microsoft. There's a company called Handspring. Handspring was founded by the founders of Palm.
Right.
In a dramatic turn, Palm's own founders became competitors. Because when they were purchased by 3Com, Jeff Hawkins and Donna Davinsky were frustrated with 3Com's level of control, and they left in mid-1998.
As I say, the strategic synergy didn't, I would say, materialize.
Didn't work for them. Didn't materialize for them. And they founded Handspring in mid-1998. And they later were joined by their third founder, Ed Culligan. And so in 1999, Handspring releases this PDA called the Visor, which was a PDA running Palm's operating system under license. And the Visor was essentially a cheaper, some might say funkier, clone of the Palm. And it even used the same hot sync and Graffiti technology. But it introduced this expansion slot, what we were talking about earlier, the Springboard expansion slot for add-on modules like memory cards, modems, and there was even an MP3 player. Handspring's entry showed how vibrant this ecosystem had become, and even competitors used Palm software. So by late 1999, 3Com realized Palm needed full freedom to compete and to pursue technologies like wireless, etc. So they moved to spin off Palm as an independent entity so it could be more nimble in a fast-changing market. And ironically, Palm's spinoff coincided with Handspring's rise. So the very day 3Com announced Palm's separation, the Handspring's Visor hit store shelves. It was like a friendly rivalry between Palm and Handspring that would later come full circle.
Oh, wow. So it's a lot of turbulence in its corporate structure.
Yeah, but there was this other competitive dynamic that was alarming at the time. Not necessarily at the time as much as we see it now, but it was the BlackBerry. Right. 1999, Research in Motion, a Canadian company, introduces the BlackBerry, essentially a two-way pager focused on mobile email for enterprise users. And they had evolved from a page. In the early years, they were originally a pager to a PDA to a full smartphone. So now you kind of see this categoric shift to connectivity that's wireless, and BlackBerry
was still tethered,
competing on that.
I mean, Palm was still a tethered device in some ways, right? Meaning,
100%.
You need a dock to sync. Now with BlackBerry, you don't need that anymore. You cut the cord, and you're totally wireless.
Yeah, and so Palm had these devices that were more popular with consumers and early adopters, and they suddenly faced this enterprise powerhouse competitor that offered something, right, that Palm OS couldn't do: seamless corporate email, right, and robust security.
Yeah, but also it's a fundamental technology shift. Like
100%.
Like with wireless, now you're talking about two-way, and you're talking about real-time synchronization, and that's a that delivers a whole new set of value.
Yeah, it was wireless. It could be a phone, but then the things it could sync were more high value. It could sync corporate email, and it could do it at a level of security that was demanded by corporations. And so Palm finds itself at a strategic crossroads around 2001, 2002. Sales of standalone PDAs are leveling off. They peaked at 2001 at 13.5 million.
Right. It's one of those graphs where you see the crossing the curve.
Yeah.
One goes down, the other goes up.
Totally. You can see, you can see it about to fall. And the future clearly belonged to these devices that combine PDA functions with cell phones. These are called smartphones.
Yeah, literally the category of smartphones.
Yes. And so Palm's leadership did recognize this and began shifting accordingly, but it was not a straightforward transition. And the company's complex corporate maneuvers at the time reflected that turbulence.
So, Thamer, how did Palm navigate these competitive forces? Sounds like it was a big challenge.
It was a lot of stuff happening at the same time, and it was really complicated. Number one, they restructured themselves into this hardware unit and a software unit.
Right. They split off the OS, right?
They split off the OS part and the hardware part. They knew they had to make a big leap to compete, and they had to move on from the classic Palm OS, which was aging and couldn't really handle some of the modern needs of this smartphone category. So they made this fateful decision to build this new, entirely from scratch operating system. And they brought in new talent like John Rubinstein, who was a former Apple hardware guru and later a leader at many hardware companies, and Matthias Duarte, who's a gifted user interface designer who came from Danger, who later became famous for his work on leading the Android design. They created a Skunkworks project codenamed Nova, which later became known as WebOS. This would be Palm's moonshot to reinvent itself for the iPhone age.
And they launched it, right? I remember WebOS.
Yeah, you remember the Palm Pre?
Yeah.
So what they did is they basically created a competitor to the BlackBerry.
Right.
It was a phone that had a thumb keyboard.
Right. So it had a hardware keyboard.
It had a hardware keyboard on it.
So Palm split up into OS and separate the hardware. What happens next? It sounds like they have a strategy now to compete with BlackBerry.
Well, I think they were competing with BlackBerry, but this other thing was emerging that they have yet to really fully experience, which was the juggernaut of the full iPhone ecosystem.
Right. iPhone launched in 2007, I remember. And it was basically, in some ways, it disrupted the entire industry. Not just smartphones, but literally mobile category.
Yes. And, once Apple figured out how they were going to do the developer ecosystem for the iPhone, it was game over. Because then all the vertical apps that airlines are using for scenario X or Y or whatever all moved to the iPhone or moved to other devices.
Well, and also there was a free OS called Android. That was the other.
Yes,
I would say, if there was an open ecosystem, that was Android, and then Apple was a closed ecosystem. So they basically, between those two OSs, I don't think there was a space or really a market for another one.
Yeah, and there's interest. In the final chapter here ends up with HP Hewlett Packard acquiring Palm. It was driven by this vision of using the WebOS asset, which was very compelling. Operating systems at that level for that form factor were not a dime a dozen. HP believed that there was value in WebOS. And HP wanted to unveil a new suite of devices, etc. But really, HP's plans for WebOS collapse in a matter of months. And they end up ceasing all WebOS device operations. And they end up selling WebOS. And you know who they sold it to?
3Com? I don't know.
No, that would be weird, right? Back and forth. They sold it to Korean consumer electronics manufacturer LG. So anybody out there who has seen an LG television, they are all running a descendant of the WebOS.
So it does live on in some form.
It does live on in some form.
But I would say the technology goes in these waves and cycles, and when you have major disruptions like an iPhone, in some ways they are like black swan events, and it's really hard for companies to adapt and adjust and continue to be successful. And I think that's what makes working in technology such a exciting, but also a challenging space. But there are some key lessons learned. I would say that I would say it's still relevant
100%.
for a lot of listeners today.
100%.
You want to go through some of those lessons?
Yeah, I mean, Albert, there's these timeless design principles, right? There's constraint-driven innovation, user-centered design, ecosystems thinking. All these things come together in the story.
Yeah, I would say for me, probably the underlying one is simplicity versus complexity. Like I think that's a theme that, like, even from early on when Jeff Hawkins made that wooden prototype, that block of wood, like just focusing on the core user needs and those one or two or few features that you can solve really well. That's such a evergreen lesson. I think the other part, remember we talked about how he would take it out and he would actually try to use it and pretend to use it and like, oh, it's 3 clicks. This idea of 3 taps away, like this purpose built versus general purpose devices. It's such a core lesson for a lot of us when we kind of set forth in trying to create a product.
Yeah, I think there's another lesson for me outside of the product, which is kind of the market hype that can happen and the market dynamics. There was a moment in March 2000 around when Palm IPO'd. It was being spun off from 3Com. This is around the year 2000, March 2000. And on its first day of trading, Palm's stock price soars to give them a market capitalization of over $53 billion. At that time,
wow.
That was more than Apple was valued.
Yeah, it's definitely more than what NVIDIA was valued back then.
Yes, it's great. And so if people remember that era was kind of the .com bubble, and there was just all this hype, and it's just so interesting to imagine how this was the it company at that moment, and how it doesn't exist anymore. And so whenever I look at what's happening any given day and any given hype cycle, I always try to remember these kinds of stories.
There's no such thing as incumbency in tech.
Yeah, and nothing's guaranteed.
Yeah. So with that, I think the PalmPilot represents a pivotal moment in the evolution of personal computing. It is the first truly successful product that bridged our desktop with our mobile experiences. Even today, a lot of the UX, UI paradigms are kind of, I would say, built on the lessons from Palm.
Yeah, there's a lot to learn and a lot to apply there. And it really succeeded by not trying to replicate a desktop experience on a small screen, which was what was happening a lot at the time. It was really trying to imagine what computing could be when it fits in your pocket and it travels with you throughout your day. And it was a reminder that innovation doesn't come from necessarily the largest companies with the most resources. It comes with somebody who has an idea who wants to make it real.
Yeah, especially in this next era. Like I think there's going to be a lot of there is already being a lot of excitement and hype around AI and potentially new devices, new categories. But I think keeping on that philosophy of being very focused and simplicity rather than complexity, I do think it's a reminder for all of us that our job as creators, as product builder, is to help make sure only what you need is a key part of our designs.
Yeah, it's not about cramming every possible feature. It's about understanding what really matters to people and executing that with excellence. And that's a wrap for today's episode on the PalmPilot. I'd like to thank all of you for listening in. Please subscribe if you haven't and leave a review. Also, please keep sending us feedback via our channels on LinkedIn and Instagram, which our contact info will be in the show notes. And Albert, thank you for joining us.
That was actually Palm. I felt like there's so many lessons learned, and hopefully everyone enjoyed the episode and look forward to our next one, Thamer.
Thanks, Albert. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks.